basis as well. So agriculture is the foundation of civilization. It began about 10,000 years ago. The domestication of animals and crops led to secure food supplies, and these secure food supplies allowed towns, cities, and nations to develop and flourish. The world that we take for granted is all based on agriculture. So how does climate change affect all this? And what does climate change even mean? Because they talk about climate change, but change from what? You know, what are we changing? And that was always a question that I had until I was introduced to this geologic timeline. And to really understand climate change, you really need to look at it from a geologic perspective, because that answers the question of change from what. So this is a timeline of the temperature of the planet since the beginning of complex life. This is the beginning of this then is the Paleozoic era, and you had the Cambrian explosion of thriving life in the seas, but the planet was very, very hot, much hotter than what we are familiar with now. It was a different world. Slowly, the temperature of the planet began to cool, and early hominids didn't begin until the Pliocene era. And the temperature then starts decreasing until you get to the Ice Age in the Pleistocene. So there was no agriculture during this period. There was humanity. They were gatherers and hunters, but there was no agriculture for the simple reason it was because the planet was too cold. Much of it was covered in ice, and life was very tenuous. But then about 10,000 years ago, the temperature of the planet began to warm. And it's no coincidence then that as the planet warmed about 10,000 years ago, that's when we were able to develop agriculture, because the planet reached the perfect temperature right here on this baseline. So for the past 10,000 years then, we have had civilization, and we have had agriculture, and as a result, civilization, because the climate has allowed it, because the planet has just the right conditions. It's been a relatively stable, mild climate with predictable seasons where you had planting in the spring and harvesting in the fall. We very much relied on having stable, predictable, relatively mild weather to grow our crops and to raise our food animals. Now, there was one small exception, or there was actually several, but the most notable one is the Little Ice Age during the Middle Ages. And we are now about 1 degree off this baseline, and we're starting to see effects. So what did the Little Ice Age look like? There was this little blip, this little deviation below this Holocene baseline. And we are fortunate in that painters during the Little Ice Age documented for us in their paintings what the world looked like. And it was a frozen wasteland. The seasons were extremely cold. You have frost fairs in Thames that froze over for months on end. They had fairs on the ice, hunters in the snow, ice skating on in Rotterdam. But what's most important is that the Little Ice Age was noted for crop failures, bread riots, famine, and wars during this period of cooling, natural cooling. We don't know exactly what caused it. There's some theories as to what caused it, but it was a cooling. It had a profound impact on civilization. And the author, Philippe Blom, this was a very interesting book. This is a really thick book. If you're interested in learning more about the Little Ice Age, you can read about Global Crisis, which is a huge, thick tome. This is a bit more readable, Nature's Mutiny. But what Philippe Blom, the author of this, found was that there was a correlation between severe weather, crop failures, and witch burnings in Northern Europe. In other words, somebody had to be blamed for the bad weather and crop failures, and it was usually poor elderly women who were accused of cavorting with the devil, causing the bad weather and the famine, and so they were often burned at the stake. So when you had bad weather and a bad crop, the blame, the scapegoat went up to appease the gods. So, you know, that was a very, I thought, interesting observation of what was going on in society during the Little Ice Age. So now, in terms of the widespread hunger in the world now, this is from 2015 from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, there are still many countries that are food insecure now. I mean, climate change is just beginning, and you've got a number of countries, notably in sub-Saharan Africa, where food insecurity is a problem. Now, unfortunately, the World Bank back in 2010 did some modeling to see what would be the impact of climate change on agriculture in the future. And they estimated that in 2050, or about 30 years from now, due to climate change effects, if we are continuing with business as usual, assuming current agricultural practices and crop varieties, much of the world is going to become too hot and too dry to grow food, and you're going to get significant reductions in yields around much of the world. Canada, the Arctic tundra are not going to be as badly affected, but then the key question is, well, how rich is the soil up in Siberia or the Arctic tundra? And my Canadian colleagues tell me that the soil is not very good. So we can't assume that Canada and Russia are going to become the breadbaskets to the world. So this is something that I am most concerned about. I mean, you know, we are dealing with this pandemic, which is awful, but what's really going to end civilization is the effect of climate change on our agricultural yields. This is going to be a global crisis that trying to get the word out about this has been very hard because we're just so obsessed with, you know, our more immediate short-term problems. So how do these greenhouse gases work? You know, we talk about the greenhouse effect. Well, here in the more northern climes in the winter, we can't grow crops. So, you know, we have what are called greenhouses. I don't know if you're familiar with them. I don't know if you use them in Africa, but you have these glass enclosed houses that provide warmth for crops to grow, for plants to grow. And the glass traps, the glass traps the heat from the sun. And you can think of the Earth's atmosphere as kind of like a greenhouse. Now, without all of the greenhouse gases that we're emitting, a lot of the heat from the sun bounces back into the space. And so the Earth has been able to maintain a relatively, you know, during the whole Holocene period, a very nice temperature for agriculture. But we're now starting to pump greenhouse gases, methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, making this a much denser atmosphere, making it more like a glass house where the heat just stays in and heats up the planet. So these gases, the main greenhouse gases that we should be concerned about are carbon dioxide, methane, which is 28 times or about 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping heat, and nitrous oxide, which is about almost 300 or 265 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So these are the main greenhouse gases that we should be concerned about. And so carbon dioxide, about 65% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we emit into the atmosphere, most of it is carbon dioxide. But there's a sizable fraction of methane and nitrous oxide, which are much more potent than carbon dioxide. And unfortunately, agriculture plays a big role in emitting these more potent greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide. So these are the different by economic sector, and I'm particularly interested in agriculture because it's very much a One Health issue. Agriculture, forestry, and land use, whether it's deforestation or how we treat the soils, these all have important implications for the emission of methane and nitrous oxide. So agriculture then is both threatened by climate change, but it also contributes to climate change. And particularly cattle or livestock agriculture, you've got the front end of the cow with enteric fermentation emitting a lot of methane, a major source of methane. And you've got the back end of the cow that's emitting manure and soil, which gets placed into the soil. And that's a major emitter, one of the largest emitters of nitrous oxide. Again, almost 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide, 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So the Food and Agriculture estimates that in terms of greenhouse gases by species, beef and dairy, sorry, is there a question? I'm happy to take questions at the end. Let me just continue on. So according to the FAO, beef and dairy cattle produce by far the largest percentage of livestock emissions. These other animals produce some, but nothing to the extent of beef and dairy cattle. So they are where we should target most of our efforts to reduce this. And so why are they? Well, they're ruminants. And this has a microbial root cause. So ruminants have 4-chambered stomachs, which enables them to digest the grasses and hays and other feedstuffs that provide them with nourishment. But most importantly, they have this chamber of the stomach called a rumen, which is loaded with bacteria that produce methane. They're called methanogenic bacteria. And so these bacteria then, when they ferment the feedstuff, they produce methane, the cow burps, and the methane gets released. The amount of methane depends on what you feed the cow, as well as the genetics of the cow itself. So there are ways to decrease the amount of methane produced, but it requires intervention. So in terms of soil management, it's putting the nitrogen-rich manure either as fertilizer, or if the animal just drops it on the field, that contributes to the soil microbes that produce nitrous oxide. The more nitrogen that you put in, the more fertilizer that you put in, the more nitrous oxide the soil emits. And the things that cause more nitrous oxide emissions include high nitrogen fertilizers, water irrigation, and tillage, or the turning, digging, and overturning of the soil, which is a common practice in agriculture, releases these gases into the atmosphere. So there are strategies to reduce that through no-till farming, low nitrogen fertilizers, cover cropping, and a variety of other agricultural practices. So again, strategies to reduce methane from enteric fermentation, feed additives are one strategy, change the way manure is stored and handled, or to capture the methane so you can use it as a biogas. And then of course the agricultural soil management to reduce the release of nitrous oxide. So I think it's important to note that humans and their domesticated animals make up about almost 97 to 98% of the total terrestrial mammalian zoomass on Earth. And together they make a lot of manure. In fact, this one study by Barondis in Nature Sustainability, published in 2018, estimated that if you look at the world's cattle, chickens, pig, and people, in 1 year, they produce about 4 trillion kilograms of fecal matter. And I estimate that that would fill about 1.6 million Olympic-sized swimming pools with fecal matter. And that's a lot of fecal matter that we produce. So we and our domesticated animals, there's actually more chickens now on the planet than any other bird. And we're only down to like 3% left of the planet in terms of wild animals. So this is where the biodiversity is. We've got our domesticated food animals and us. There isn't a whole lot of biodiversity left at this point in time, which is why we want to protect these wild animals as much as possible, reducing their consumption, not only to preserve biodiversity, but to reduce zoonotic disease spillover risks. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, manure is very important in terms of soil health. The soil needs this rich nitrogen, and it needs the components of manure in order to grow crops. But the question is, how much manure is too much? And it's important to put it on agricultural fields, but if you put in too much, which we appear to be doing, then rain will cause runoff into waterways, and all this excess nitrogen and phosphorus flows into local lakes and waterways, leading to eutrophication or algae blooms, and that leads then to polluted water and dead fish. So again, you've got this cycle, this One Health microbial cycle of what we do in one area has implications and deleterious health effects in other areas, ultimately all coming back to us and to our health. So this concept then of fecal matter production is very important, and one that's usually not in the global One Health conversations. But this article that I think is extremely important did country level estimates of fecal matter, and some of the highest levels in the world are China, India, Brazil, the US. You know, we've got very large, intense agricultural systems. It's important to note, though, that there's very high country level production. There's more animals than humans in Australia and New Zealand, more sheep, and you'll see the importance of that in a minute. But if you look at the animal to human fecal ratio, some places stand out, including Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa, and other regions. And this is really important because there was another study that looked at antibiotic consumption per person. And what I found really striking, the amount of antibiotic per person, some of the highest levels were in Australia and New Zealand. Now, why would they have such high antibiotic use per person? But if you look at the countries with the highest animal to human fecal ratio, they had among the highest. And so their environment then is very dense with animal fecal matter, which might be affecting then human health, leading to increased antibiotic use. And so the question then is there a relationship between environmental fecal contamination, most notably from animals, and antibiotic consumption? The question then is large-scale animal agriculture ecologically sustainable because we're raising hundreds, if not thousands, of animals together? They produce a lot of waste, and that waste has to go somewhere. And it's usually put on agricultural fields, or the nitrous oxide goes up into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. I mean, so these are all really complex issues that fundamentally get back to the root cause of, well, is meat a human right? Because it comes with all of these negative environmental consequences that ultimately impact our health and the health of our planet. All of this fecal waste, of course, not only contaminates the soils and the waterways, but it increases our risk for foodborne and waterborne illnesses, because if you've got fecal contamination of our plants, our food, and our water, that leads to illness. And as a result, leads to increasing antibiotic use and antimicrobial resistance. So there is a few studies looking at animal fecal matter in human health. This one study in particular in Environmental Science and Technology they found that sanitation systems that we have typically address only human fecal waste, but not animal fecal waste. And yet 80% of the waste that's being produced is from animals. There's 30 billion food animals. That's just the mammalian food animals. That's not even including all the poultry that's producing trillions of kilograms of fecal matter. And so in developing countries, many of these animals are living in or near the homes of people. It contaminates domestic environments. And so, you know, we have to figure out, well, what's the magnitude of this problem? There's many pathways of exposure to animal fecal matter, whether it's water contamination, soil, food. You have contamination in flies, hand contamination, and fomite contamination, including feeding utensils and toys for kids. And in this study, they identified only 7 intervention studies that aim to reduce the exposure to animal fecal matter. So again, most of our emphasis is on human fecal matter in terms of looking at fecal-oral transmission pathways. But really what we need to be looking at is the exposure to animal fecal matter in terms of human disease, because it has profoundly negative health outcomes for both adults and children. So we need to change our paradigm, which is why a One Health paradigm is so important. When we're looking at these microbial systems in our environment, we need to include looking at the animals and not just the humans. We're missing a big part of the picture. That having been said, we're discovering more and more that these microbes that live on us and in us, our microbiomes, are as important to our health and well-being as any organ. And so we have these delicate microbial ecosystems on and in our body. Animals do too. When we use antibiotics, we're disrupting this microbiome. And these antibiotics have a profound impact on the biome of the planet as well. And that's another whole talk. I don't have time to get into that, but this is the environmental component of antimicrobial resistance and manure is huge. And so these massive amounts of human and animal waste that we're, you know, putting into the environment each year, trillions of kilograms each year, are altering the microbial ecosystem, biosystem of our planet. And it's contaminating not only the soils and the waters, but it's affecting the atmosphere through methane and nitrous oxides. And this is all microbial driven. So then a One Health approach to food security and climate change. Well, we recognize that food security is the foundation of civilization. It is essential for the health and well-being of humans and other animals. The most profound way that we interact with our environment is by inhaling air, drinking water, and eating food. And if that's contaminated with fecal matter, then we're going to get sick. Many of these emerging zoonotic diseases, whether they're viruses or bacteria, they spill over into people either directly or indirectly through agriculture by what we eat, or sometimes what we inhale. So we have to decide then if a meat-rich diet, particularly eating endangered and wild animals, is a human right, because it is adversely affecting our health and it's diminishing the biodiversity of the planet. There just aren't that many wild animals left. In terms of large-scale animal agriculture, if we want to try to meet the animal protein needs of everybody, rather than eating wild animals, we need to raise food animals, but that also comes with risks, and that includes, for example, enteric fermentation from cattle, manure and soil management practices that are major sources of methane and nitrous oxide, which are the most potent of greenhouse gases. So we need to address that. And then this excess manure contaminates soil, water, food, and emits nitrous oxide. So we need to have technologies then to reduce these greenhouse gases from agriculture. We require an investment and political support in order to get that done. So it's all tied together, this microbial network of our planet. from, from what we eat to the waste that we produce, affecting the environment and affecting our atmosphere. So the bottom line then is we must figure out how to feed ourselves sustainably to maintain our civilization on a hotter and drier planet. And that's a very tall order that faces us. We need to work together on this. We need to integrate our efforts to benefit humans, animals, and the environment in a One Health approach. And we need to work collaboratively, not against each other, which tragically, the politics that's surrounding our planet right now is really coming at the worst, not that it would ever be good, but it's coming at the worst possible time when we're really at the crux, and we really need to start coming together as a species to preserve civilization. One last thought is perhaps a solution of insects. Now, about 2 billion people around the world eat insects. They are extremely efficient at converting feed to food. They're very high quality protein, use minimal water, produce very little waste, don't require much land, and they can also be used to supplement animal feed for protein. But there's a major obstacle, particularly in Western countries, and that's the ick factor. So this is a potential solution, but we would have to overcome our cultural revulsion to eating these things in the West. There is an exception, lobsters, which are insects of the sea, and we pay a lot of money for them as gourmet food, but at one time they were considered vermin and fed to the poor or to prisoners, and that was changed through advertising. So, cultural perceptions can change, but it takes time. But this is a potential solution to feed the world, to provide the protein needs that help improve our health and well-being. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention. These are my collaborators with the One Health Initiative: Bruce Kaplan, Tom Monath, Lisa Conti, Thomas Ewell, Helena Chaplin, Craig Carter, and Becky Barentine. We all are part of this One Health Initiative, and I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.